So if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Mark chapter 8, because we've been going through a series entitled The Simple Gospel. And the more we've gone through it, the more people have asked me, it doesn't seem to be that simple, Mike, because we're only on chapter 8 and we've spent months in this book now. But here is what we're finding as we're going through this, that God is aligning a group of people to follow Him. And God aligning a group of people to follow Him doesn't just happen as easy as going, hey, come be my disciple. And they go, cool, we got this. What we find is when Jesus says, come be my disciple, they bring with them all the baggage, all their religious history, everything they got. And they don't just come follow Him when it's exciting. They're following Him through some very difficult positions, both in the culture and also in their hearts. And so Jesus is having to shepherd them and go, I want you to follow me. And they're having to go, we want to, but we don't know how. We thought we were. Have you ever thought you were following Jesus to realize like you were just following your own passions and wants and desires? The disciples go through the same trajectory. This isn't just you having to endure this, and you're looking at people that were perfect in the Bible. What you're finding in your life, and what I'm finding in my life, is that Jesus calls us out. He separates us. We've said this from the beginning. You are a peculiar people, that you should show forth the excellencies and mercies of Him who called you out. Jesus is taking this group of people, these 12 disciples, and He's saying, I want you to go be fishers of men. I want to teach you to do as I do. I want to teach you to be as I am. I want to teach you to follow me. And at first, the disciples are always like, just when anybody volunteers for anything, you go, I'm in. You ever felt that way? Something seemed really cool and they wanted volunteers, and you're like, I'm in. The disciples are like, I'm in. They're ready for this. So in Mark chapter 8, what we're finding is that the writer of this book, Mark, is beginning to show us that the disciples' lives weren't as perfect as oftentimes people and readers want them to be. That this group of men, these 12, had hardened hearts. This group of men, these 12, even though they were called by Jesus, had to deal with many things internally that oftentimes could wreck their world, wreck their lives, and they were having to go to Jesus, and Jesus was having to come to them and say, hold on, let me remind you who you're following. Let me remind you why you are here. And so this morning, as a church, what I want us to begin to recognize is the remembrance of who we're following and why we're here. That it's not just about creating a space that's an empty space. It's not just about creating environments where we come in, learn about theological things, and then walk out back to the exhaustedness of this. That Jesus is going, I want to show you, I want to be this for you, and I want you to understand that you're not the first person to have to go through this. So whatever it is that you're walking in this door with, whatever it is that you came in here going, man, you don't know my world. Jesus knows your world. And in Mark 8, we're seeing a story here that oftentimes you look at and go, this is just one of the miracles of Jesus. But I want to take this deeper for you. So in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 22, I'll read the story first, and then we'll spend a few minutes and kind of walk our way through it. So here's what it says in verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? Oh, I just keep on going, but we'll keep going. I'll finish the story first, all right? I said I would. He looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. He opened his eyes, and sight was restored. And he saw everything. How? Man, that's a good day. And he sent him to his home, saying, what? Do not even enter the village. Keep this one to yourself again. So we're asking these questions. Why is it that Jesus keeps on telling people, don't go back into the village? Don't tell no one who did this. Why is it that this keeps coming back up over and over and over again? Because if you heal somebody, what would you want them to go do? You would want them to go tell. Like, it's testimony time. Get up, jump around. You once could not hear, but now you can hear. You once couldn't see, but now you can see. Like what our lives as people who are in the process of becoming disciples, the first thing that we often recognize is this. We want to go tell. But sometimes Jesus is in the process of trying to teach someone else something. So Jesus takes this guy out of the village, disciples with him. So who is this story probably for? The disciples. Now, we've gone through the past few weeks walking through how the disciples test many things Jesus said. Like, Jesus said, come follow me, and they did that, but then they get in the boat, and they have one loaf of bread, and they panic, even though Jesus had just fed 5,000 people, even though Jesus had fed 7,000 people, they still panic over one loaf of bread. They've seen how Jesus has healed people. And they asked, what was the purpose of that? Why? So Jesus is over and over again in the process of making a disciple, having to lay the framework and the foundation continually. This is what a disciple is. This is what a disciple does. And Mark has showed us in this chapter that these disciples had got into a spot in their life where their hearts, even though they followed Jesus with their feet, their hearts were hardened towards the things of God. That is an important revelation for us. That it is possible to go to church. It is possible to sing the songs. And even though you're making the physical steps, your heart is hard. But Jesus doesn't want you to stay there. That's not the place where you get to rest. That's not the place where you get to go, well, because of my hard heart, here's just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to sit down and I'll go to church and have a hard heart. But I took the steps. Many people would define that as success. There are many people in our culture that go, as long as you just make the steps and get there and sit down, you are highly successful. But if we want to be a church that makes disciples, we have to begin to engage this process of taking the steps with our feet is only part of what God is doing in our lives. That there's also heart action, which must take place. So Jesus tells this story. Mark shows us this story. If he takes this blind person out, and then he goes, I'm going to heal you. Touches his eyes, and then here's what he says to him. He asked him, do you see anything? One of the questions that I have for you this morning as a disciple, who is supposed to be making disciples, but just as a disciple, here's my question. I want you to write this down, put it in your notes, in your phone, wherever it is, however you do this, is this. Do you see anything? That right now in this life that God has called you to, with the way that God is asking you to walk, with the way your heart is supposed to be moving, here's the question that I want us as disciples to hear is, do we see anything? As we look at the world around, as we look at our neighbors, do we see anything? As you look at the people that you work with, do you see anything? As you walk into the grocery store, do you see anything? This is a real question Jesus asked. This is a real statement that is beginning to make its way into the hearts, not just of the guy who was blind but can now see, but this is beginning to make its way into the disciples as they were standing there watching this. Do you see anything? This is an important question. Because a couple responses are this. One is this: no, I don't see anything. That can be a response of someone in this room today. What did I see this week? Just my job. What did I see this week? Just more turmoil and work. What did I see this week? Just my stuff. Today, Jesus wants to free you of that. Today, Jesus wants to begin to open your eyes once more to seeing something different. So Jesus asked this gentleman, who he's touched his eyes, do you see anything? This is not a person that's ignoring Jesus. This is a person that's actively engaging Jesus. And here's what the guy says, I see. Here's what I see. He looked up and he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Second response, you may see people, but they're just big things walking around. They're just things that are in the world, inanimate as a tree, inanimate as a car, inanimate as your stuff. They're just things. So the guy says, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. Could Jesus have stopped there? In your own life as a disciple, it could stop there. You could still go through this life and just see people as big trees walking around. No souls, no hearts, doesn't matter. Don't bleed, don't have grace, don't have mercy. They're just things walking around. Some of us live our lives at this juncture. Do you see? Oh yeah, I see. But I see things differently than the rest of the world sees them. The way I see them, they're just people. I got my life, and what? They got theirs. That is part of the definition of I see people, but they look like trees walking around. If you get into conversations and you go, I got my life, and they got theirs, there's a chance in your discipleship process that this story is really laying into you. Because Jesus isn't just trying to restore sight to a blind man. Jesus is trying to restore sight to his disciples. This is a conversation. See, y'all, this excites me. This is a conversation for the disciples. This wasn't a conversation for the blind man. And most of us read this story, and who's it about? The blind man. But it wasn't. This is about the people that follow him. This is about the 12 people that said, I'm in. This is about, I was at a conversation this week. This is about the kingdom builders. What do you see? How do you see? And what we have to get to the point of, where we examine our hearts and we look around us and we go, here's how I see people. I don't just see them as tall trees, inanimate objects simply existing. Jesus doesn't stop here. He moves on, and here's what he does. Verse 25. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. Some of us need to have the hands of the Master touch us again. Did y'all get that? Some of us need the touch of the Master again. We know what the touch was like. We know the intimacy of the experience that preceded knowing Jesus. When he touched our eyes, when this blind man's eyes were touched the first time, he knew the heart and the power and the depth that emerged out of Jesus. We see over and over in Scripture that when Jesus touched somebody or somebody touched Jesus, power was transferred. This guy, as Jesus spits, again, I mean, this is, we talk about this, teenagers, guys, Ethan and Brandon. Like, it would be gross if somebody was coming to school and was like, I'm going to spit on y'all, and I'm going to take care of whatever you got going on. You wouldn't look at that and go, cool. Now, you're in middle school, you might would. But most people, apart from middle school, wouldn't assume spit as a cool thing. But we get to this space where Jesus goes, I am going to engage your life like never before. And most of us that are in this room have at one time or another said, bring it on. I'm ready. And we were excited. We were passionate. And we felt the power of the Master come upon our lives. And we began to walk. We began to walk in faith. We began to walk in step of following Jesus, a disciple after the heart of the Master. And we pursued him passionately. We pursued him intimately. But we didn't realize this. The baggage of our lives we were still carrying with us. And at some point in time or another, Jesus was going to engage our baggage as well. That he was coming after that too. So, this blind gentleman that Jesus says, I've touched you and I've healed you. Do you see clearly yet? The guy could have said, I'm good. Like, you've given me more sight than I've ever had in my life. Like, peace out. I'm out of here. Some of us do that with church, though. Like, we've gotten more freedom than we've ever had. Like, all of a sudden, we walk in, and the gospel seems alive. The simple gospel seems real. And we take it, we apply it, and we go, man, this is amazing. I no longer have to carry the condemnation and the weight of my sin. I'm a free man. I don't have to go to church if I don't want to. I don't have to do anything. Why? Because I'm free. I've been saved. I've been redeemed. I've been redeemed. See, I love singing kids' songs in the process. It just happens. But we get to this point, and then we go, I'm good. And the roller coaster goes from the top, and we go, this is great. But then all of a sudden, it's kids, it's finances, it's jobs, it's life, it's sicknesses, it's adulting is the new word. It's all of these things. And then all of a sudden, we're in this spot where it was great. I could see, I was good. And now we're going, but I still don't think I see clearly yet. And you find yourself at a space where you go, maybe I'm still not seeing as clearly as I could. This gentleman realizes quickly something still needs to be more clear. Because I see people walking around his trees. Jesus could have said, good, man. Like, that's a great spot to be in. Don't hit anything. Like, that's part of what seeing at that level can do for you. It can just give you the ability to not hit stuff. But Jesus wasn't apt to stop there. You see, in our hearts and our lives, as disciples who make disciples, Jesus wants us to be able to see clearly. He wants us to be able to see through the storm. He wants us to be able to see through the trial. He wants us to be able to see through the sin, through the stress, through the circumstances, through the exhaustion, that he is still good. That even in the midst of whatever we're going through, that God is still on the throne. So he doesn't stop with this gentleman. Again, he touches his eyes. He laid his hands on his eyes again, and the eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything. How? Clearly. If there was one thing I would want you to leave with today, my prayer is this, that God will touch you in a way that you can see things clearly. What a prayer that is for the life of the discipler. That you, as a disciple, can see things clearly. Because when you can see things clearly, all of a sudden, people, you give grace. People, you give mercy. Why? Because in seeing things clearly, here's what you recognize. Just as Paul recognized, I am the chief of all sinners. When you see things clearly, here's what you're going to begin to understand. You're not the perfect one. You're following the perfect one. You're proclaiming the honor and the praise and the glory of the perfect one. And everything about your life says, I am not, but he is. I could not, but he could. In my weakness, he is strong. I will not only walk in step, but I will also walk in sight, because he has cleared my eyes to see that I am a sinner saved by grace. And here's the thing, I'm okay with that. Some of us aren't okay with being a sinner saved by grace. That we want to be something different. That we want to be better than all of that. That we want to have praise, we want to have glory, we want to have accolades, we want to have a happy life. We want to have the roller coaster life on the top all the time. But we are but sinners saved by grace. A church that makes disciples, understands this, that every scenario I walk into, I am but a sinner saved by grace. And I will not walk into any scenario better than anybody else. But I will walk into every scenario proclaiming the glory of him who sits on the throne. My job, my neighborhood, my home, my employment, everywhere, my city. We have a church that we're looking at going, why are we here? What are we doing? We are in this community for a purpose, for a reason, so that we can show forth the glories of him who's called us out. So here's what I believe. We've made more seats, not to give us more room to breathe, but for what purpose? Make disciples. And it's not just me to make disciples. Like, we didn't have line t-shirts just so we could go, here y'all go. I want y'all to understand you're disciples of the line. No. No one doesn't have a clue what the line is. You wear a line shirt out, and you go, what is that? There's a church called The Line. It's a conversation piece now. You walk to the mall, The Line Church. What is that? Let me tell you about it. See clearly. Begin to see people as God sees people. Begin to see your job the way God sees your job. Begin to see your life the way God sees your life. It is one way for you to look at it from a perspective of it's all about me. It's another way to look at it from the perspective of it's all about him. It's either all about you or it's all about him. And your actions will speak louder than your words. How did you do this week at making disciples? Not in a condescending way, but in a way that Jesus says, I'm trying to open your eyes to this. You think you have found the pinnacle of freedom. You still may just be seeing people walking around as tall trees. You've still got way farther to go in the clearing of your sight. Because disciples make disciples. But disciples that are half-blinded don't do that. Disciples whose hearts are hardened don't go make more disciples. See, the Bible tells us you will be known by your fruit. And he gives us this big old long story about how an apple tree isn't going to produce oranges and all of these different stories about this. And here's what we're getting to for us as Christians. If you're going to be a follower of Christ, guess what we should be producing? Fruit. More disciples. Why wouldn't we? Because some of us still aren't seeing clearly. And Jesus doesn't want to leave us in that spot. Jesus knows you can't fix yourself in that spot. The other beautiful thing of the gospel that is simple is this, that when Jesus sees that the gentleman still sees people as walking around as tall trees, what does Jesus do? Touches them again. More power is taken from Jesus to the disciple. If you still see people as just inanimate objects walking around, you do not have to stay in that spot this morning. And it is not conditional upon your power. It is not conditional upon your skill set. It is not conditional upon even you going, okay, I want it. It's conditional upon this. Jesus just touching you. And Jesus says, I've come that all may have life. So Jesus wants to touch all of you today. He wants to restore sight to all of you today. So as we get to this time where we begin to process through, what is God doing in my life? What is God doing in my world? The question that we bring to the table, the question that I offer you this morning is this: are you seeing clearly? Because as you see clearly, you will begin to have a heart for people as God has a heart for people. But not just will you begin to have a heart for people as God has a heart for people. You'll begin to have a love for people that the Father also has love for you. It's amazing what God wants to produce in our lives. The clarity of vision, the clarity of sight that the disciple gets to walk with, that you and I get to experience. So today as you are here, if sin has eroded your world, come to the cross and find grace and forgiveness. If life has beaten you down to the point to where you don't see clearly right now, come to the foot of the cross, come to the altar this morning and go, God, I need you to touch me again. Restore my sight. Help me to see clearly. Lord, help me to see people as you see people. God, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. And as he does that, you will see differently. You will live differently. And you will walk differently. And it will be all to the praise and the honor of Jesus. Let's close our eyes and bow our heads.